Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, my name is Rory. You are watching Varietal Literature, a channel on YouTube that is a group of writers from Vancouver who enjoy narrative. And what we do tonight is we read old folklore and folktales. In the case of tonight, some stuff that has previously been untranslated to English, so is fairly unlikely to be something you've heard before, which is quite literally 4 different folk tales from Germany about ghosts that bowl. And then we'll read a Nordic tale, a Norwegian tale, about ghosts. Because basically what we're doing this month is we're reading about ghosts. Now, the reason we're reading about ghosts is because I believe, and I think correctly, that January is the true horror month. We're not really doing horror stories. We're kind of just doing ghost stories, which are a mixed bag. But it's the month of the dead is what I call it, because nothing good happens in January. If you have had good things happen in January, you let me know in the comments, or you can let me know in the chat if you're watching live. By the way, if you're not watching live and you want to skip over the chat and just get straight to the folklore, down in the description below, there will be a set of timestamps with the stories that I'm reading. Click on the timestamps, it'll jump you ahead. If you do not currently see that, then you are watching me live. Hello. You can join me in the chat if you want to make comments on the stories, but also this just works as a background thing. SCGS this here says, good evening. I didn't even know that bowling was a thing that long ago. I mean, I guess I should say that these stories are collected at like 200 years ago and maybe a little bit more, like 200, 300 years ago. But actually, I'll admit, I didn't quite know bowling went back that far, although I don't know why. I wouldn't think it would. We're going to do a section that we've done once before. Which is when the translator of our tales makes a comment, gives us notes. I read them at the beginning of the next section. So this is notes from the translator of last week's tales. If you missed it, it's a bunch of stories about ghosts in the mountains. And you should definitely go and listen to it, I think. There's quite a few stories there. So this section is called Translator's Notes, and I'm just going to read the the comment from Jürgen Hubert. He says, some notes. I consider the ridge trains and the night folk to be a part of the wider range of wild hunt style phenomena, and I plan to publish them in my future book on this topic, which I look forward to reading, Jürgen. I'm no folklorist. I will say, just myself personally, Rory speaking, I see them all sort of related to strong gales and winds that can push through, because I was a mountain climber a little bit, and you get next to a crevice in the mountain and it can sound like a horde of riding horses. Untersberg, which is a mountain in the Alps that we read some stories from, which we will read more stories from, not tonight, but in the future. Untersberg legends were really popular in Germany. There were about 20 different books published in the 19th century alone, although admittedly some of them were quite short. Actually, he doesn't say in Germany, but I'm assuming that's context. Although, the Alps run through lots of places. Sleeping king / emperor myths were very widespread in Germany, although the ruler and the location tended to vary. There is even one of the Cheruscan chieftain Arminius, who was later reinterpreted as a mythical founding father of Germany. And then finally, blessed altar bread plays a huge role in German folktale thanks to its divine potency. It was often said to be used for all sorts of dark magic, and then in brackets, and actually I did know this, I didn't bring it up last week for hopefully obvious reasons, but unfortunately, host desecration, which is destroying the bread of the church, the altar bread, was also one of the more common slanders against people of Jewish descent. And I will say, before anybody, for obvious reasons, goes, oh, there must be a lot of anti-Semitism in German folktales. There definitely is. There's a whole section on it in Jürgen's sort of translations he's released, which you can get through his Patreon, which you should definitely join. I have the information down in the description right now, but also I will put a comment if you're not watching this live and pin it with that info, called oh man, I've said it so many times, Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles. But in that section, there is a section about sort of slander against Jewish descent in German folktales. But one thing I will say is it's not a German folktale exclusive thing at all. That was a thing for a good period of time. It is one of the reasons why I decided against reading any of this stuff live without having screened it beforehand, which was a conception I had originally had. It's certainly not the only people that catch the ire of folktale, but something you should know that if this is your only experience of folktales is the stuff that I read. First of all, you should probably read more. But if I'm your only exposure to some things you might not know, there's lots of random racism. Some of it's really specific and old, which is almost funny. Like there's lots of stuff in Norwegian, certain Norwegian tales I've talked about before, where they really hated the Finns for a period of time there. I don't know if that's a thing that's still going on, but that happened a lot. But the other thing is there's lots of sexuality and eroticism in the form of like basically dirty jokes. And one of the people that we're going to read tonight, Simon Roy Hughes, his translations, he did one of his early translations that he did was a collection of erotic folklore from, for lack of a better term. I mean, erotic it's not sexy. Let's put it that way. From Norway. Obviously I don't read that here because it's just not really in fitting with the mood of what I do here, but you should know that folklore covers the gamut of human experiences, because a lot of folklore is basically bar tales that people are telling each other. Okay, so that's our translator's notes. So let's get to why you're here, which of course is you want to know about bullying ghosts. Okay. Pardon me, I'm gonna get a drink of water here. All right. So I did consider, by the way, because I sometimes do sound effects, doing bowling sounds for this. And as much as it was immersive, here's the thing about bowling. It's an annoying thing to listen to. So I decided against it. You at home are welcome to add up sound effects of a bowling alley behind you. One thing that these stories do have in common, though, is wind. So, let me get the fireplace down a little bit. Let's begin our tales. Our first tale and our next three tales even come from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which is both a Patreon and a regularly updated collection of translated German folktales from Jürgen Hubert, who you can support on Patreon if you check the pinned comment below. Our first story is called The Bowling Farmers. It's very short. Our second story is also very short, so I'm going to go straight into them. And then our next two will be, after that, will be longer. At night, farmers regularly play bowling at the crossroads. between Mettmann and Lutgast. Do so without... Oh. When they play, they rarely do so without strife and quarrels. The farmers use their skulls as bowling balls, and their arm and leg bones must take the place of the pins. They have often been seen by nighttime wanderers in this manner. So not even really a story, kind of an anecdote. But it gives you an idea of what a bowling ghost is. Our next story, also from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, also quite short, is the bowling game beneath the Hohnstein. Once a herder watched over his herd beneath the Hohnstein. Then, around noon, 12 white-clad spirits approached, and immediately there was a bowling alley where there had been none before. The herder, however, received the instruction that he should set up the pins. The spirits bowled for an entire hour, and as they finished, 11 of them disappeared immediately. Before the final one vanished, though, he gave him the king pin to the herder as a reward. The herder carried the pin with him, but it became heavier and heavier until he was unable to carry it. But as soon as he let the pin drop, it turned into the purest gold. Little more of a story. Still on the borderline of an anecdote. But we get from these stories a couple of things. There is this sense in the first story that they're kind of damned to be there. And there's lots of theorizing you're welcome to do as to why. The translator theorizes perhaps they spent too much time invested in their game and not in their other parts of life, and thus Frau Gauden, who twice proclaims that she would take the hunt over heaven, is then doomed to play bowling forever, but it's never really explained. In this second one, though, we see something that is going to become a bit of a theme, which is the pins or the bowl or something like that has some kind of unexpected property, usually value. Now, this one's a little bit more of a story. This is the Golden Bowling Game from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection of German folklore translated by Jürgen Hubert. Long years ago, a brazen and godless knight lived in Schauenforst Castle, who oppressed and plagued the farmers, held up and robbed travelers and wanderers, and who was feared widely in the surrounding areas. At one time, there had been a hard, long winter, and the sheer amount of snow that suddenly melted afterwards caused rivers and streams to burst their banks. In this manner, the terrible flooding destroyed the entire harvest of the poor farmers. However, the cruel and hard-hearted lord of the castle still demanded the exact same... Woo. Oh, I know what happened. I think your sound was fine. I think mine suddenly became bad. The cruel and hard-hearted lord of the castle still demanded the exact same crushing tribute at the appointed time, and even though he beheld the great destitution and suffering of the farmers, he did not soften to any pleas. Instead, he took the last cow, the last keepsakes from those who could not pay in full at the appointed time, and had everything carried up to his castle. From this blood money, he commissioned a golden bowling set with silver balls in order to entertain himself after his feasts and drinking bouts. After this, the farmers became terribly enraged, and an old man whose entire possession had been taken by the hard-hearted knight spoke a terrible curse, that the cruel knight should play with the golden pins until Judgment Day as a punishment for his arrogance. And God, who hears the cries of the oppressed, fulfilled the old man's curse, and avenged the deprivation of the tormented farmers with severe punishment. In this manner, it is possible to hear a strange, curious rolling and rumbling from the Schauenforst mountain during quite quiet, muggy nights. This noise comes from the cruel former lord of the castle, who must play now until Judgment Day in the ruins of the fortress deep within the mountain, with the pins which he had in his arrogance made with the money extorted from his subjects in his arrogance. So that's a tale. We see that golden pin again, except this time it's considered a very bad thing. GS says, that's ruthless. Oh yeah, what happened was I bumped my headphones out, so I wasn't getting a full signal, and it turned my voice like I was going through a vocoder. It was frightening. Which brings us to our last bowling ghost story before we get on to what's called Grave Rest, a Nordland story. And this one's called The Golden Bowling Game. There's that gold again. And it's out of Yburg. Sorry, just a moment. It is said of the Yburg castle that it was once built by the Knights Templar. But these Knights of the Order were eventually all killed in one night and their home destroyed. Since then, spirits haunt this mountain. Giants and dwarves are in the castle. War cries emanate from it, and people who approach during these disturbances, well, they will be assailed with thrown rocks. People have also heard laughing, moaning, and wailing from within. Many spirits have been banished there, you see. The exorcists first put the spirits into sacks, then carry them out of the houses at midnight. These multitudes of spirits in the old castle frequently bowl. A boy who was gathering wood at the time heard a noise and went to the castle gate out of curiosity. he heard a noise. Sorry. And there an old man was waiting for him and led him to the living quarters. Inside, he found 12 men with black clothing and white beards. And one waved to the boy and indicated to him that he should set up the yellow pins, and the boy did so, but he felt that the ball was far too heavy, and when the bells of Steinbach rang 12 o'clock, the men stopped playing and put a yellow pin into his wood basket as a reward. Then everything vanished in front of his eyes as the last bell rang. The pin was too heavy for the boy, and when he saw a nice heap of firewood next to a tree trunk, he threw the pin to the ground and filled his back-carried basket with wood. He carried it to Fahrenheit and told his father that he had experienced what he had experienced. His father, however, scolded the son for not keeping the heavy pin, for it must have been made out of gold. Then, for the sake of his father, the boy ran into the forest again and reached the tree trunk where he had found the firewood, but the yellow pin was gone, and there was only a scrawny piece of wood lying there. Whenever people have business in the forest, they prefer to stay together or wait next to the road for each other so that they can walk home together. For when they travel on their own, they will frequently be led astray and brought to the castle. Then they have to turn around 3 times within the ring of the castle fortifications. If they know how precisely they have to turn, they will find the right path again and get out. So there you go. There is 4 accounts from different regions of mostly golden, some cursed, some blessed bowling games. If you aren't a true believer in these sorts of things, I do wonder what you think it might be. This account might be accounting for. I was thinking that given that it's so often in old castles, it might just be crumbling structures they're hearing. Or who knows? Maybe there is a ghost tied to bowling pins. My personal favorite, even though it's barely a story, was the one where they had to use their own bones to bowl. GS says thunder. Yeah, thunder does sort of fascinate us, doesn't it? I mean, it does even now. Even when we know exactly what's going on. Okay. So our next story is our longest story of the evening. It is a Nordic story. We usually keep these for the second half. It is not about bowling ghosts. Bowling ghosts is our main theme. But I could not find any stories about bowling ghosts in Norway. You make of that what you will. Some things are shared, though, between Germany and Norway. I mean, one was the Wild Hunt, which, well, if you want to hear more of the Wild Hunt, I did a whole thing on Wild Hunt at the beginning of December. It's called, it's not Christmas until Odin raids the countryside. That's the name of the video. It's in the playlist, the Fireside Fairytales playlist. I know that YouTube has split up video displays in a very unhelpful way for a channel such as mine. GS says less thunder in Norway. I don't know. I mean, the Wild Hunt's in Norway, and it's supposed to be them riding on a storm of lightning and thunder. Okay. So, our next tale is about Our next tale is a Nordic tale, and it is about a... Well, it's actually about a topic that we've seen come up before. I think we did a story almost a year ago in Irish myth from Yeats's book, where we talked about a fellow who tried to bury a foot of his friend because that's all he had. Now, this one's a little more serious, dramatic, and tragic, concerning a revenant. If you don't know what that is, I'm sure you will have figured it out by the end of the story, but they are a standard spirit ghost that you see in a lot of lore. But this is also from Regine Normann, who we read last week as well, who is a writer from the turn of the century, well, a little later than that, but in that range, in Norway. And she takes stories that she had learned by listening to travelers and stuff that came by her childhood home, and then sort of interprets them into a frame of people telling stories in a sort of meta fiction book. So again, as with the story last week, because this comes from the same book called Nordland Nights or Nordland Natt, is again, you should know that this is supposed to be in a book where someone is telling a story to another person. That's why it's all in quotes and everything else. So occasionally you'll see sort of oddities. And this one takes place down by the water. So this is Grave Rest from the book Nordland Night by Regine Normann, translated by Simon Roy Hughes, whose Patreon will be pinned in a comment below. And read with his permission, by the way. There were 3 boats that accompanied one another as they rode the winter fishing season off Mola, east of Lofoten. The skippers were Bont Bonsa, Suren Pirsen, and Abraham Anaxa, and all of them came from the fjord. They had not exactly chosen one of the most prestigious fjord, but their fathers before them had rowed out there for many years, without whining about the profits. The harbor was good, and rowing out was easy, since those who rowed off Mola could benefit from the wind in nearly every kind of weather, no matter from what direction it came, and this had not a little to say. But there came a year around 8 days after they had come to the fishing grounds, that there was such a dense sea fog that it was simply inadvisable to be out at sea. No matter how familiar one was with it and the landmarks, the lads had nothing to do, bouncing around their huts and getting into all sorts of troubles with their lusty ideas and monkey games. But when the evening came, each skipper demanded peace and quiet in his own hut, and Bont Bonsa, who could not get a wink of sleep unless everything about him was quiet, sat mending nets, praying that his crew would fall asleep. Now, Bont Bonsa was such that he found it difficult to quit when he had first started to work, and he remained sitting there, mending the cod net for longer than he had thought to. Yes, who knows if he would have stopped before the net had been tied up, had not the outer hut door flown open with a noisy bang. So that the walls of the hut began to come apart floor to ceiling. Bonsa had not heard people go by, and the wind was quiet, so he wondered what they were up to. Those who were now outside, he put down his work, unhooked the train oil lamp from the nail on the wall, and went out into the porch to find out what was going on. The outer door was wide open, but there was not a living thing to be seen, so he closed the door, hooked the latch on the catch, and went back in. But he hadn't come to rest on his stool before the outer door flew open with the same bang and the same shock, and in the fury that the Lord's hand had granted Bonsa, he threw down his work and went out in his socks to grab the rascals red-handed. For it had to be a scamp that was out playing, not a fright and a warning as he had originally thought. There was no one to see, and again he pulled the door close, secured the latch on the catch, and rattled the lock to make sure it was closed. Then he went into the hut, hung the net on the hook next to the window, and put the needles and the ball of string in the table drawer. For now, he wanted to take his clothes off and lie down to sleep. Well, then the front door flew open a third time, and Bonsa let go of what he had between his hands, took God's name in his mouth, and padded quietly out into the porch. But there was no one to see, and he hadn't expected there to be. He did not close the door immediately, but remained standing on the stairs, looking out over the huts. The fog had gone, and the moon and the stars were reflected in the bay. But what was that for a turn? Were his eyes deceiving him, or was that Abraham Anoxa's Femburing really lying there with its keel in the air? We've covered this before, but if you're new to the channel, Femburing is a type of boat in Norway. Particularly popular, I think, around the 17th and 18th century. Don't quote me on that, I'm not a historian. In God's name, he had to go to Abraham Anoxa's doorstep and warn him so that he could right the boat and gather together the thwarts and bottom boards and everything that lay floating before it was time to go out and haul the nets. He groped within the doorstep for his footwear, and when he straightened up, ready to go, Abraham Anoxa's Femburing lay with its mast in the air. Between Søren Petersen's Femburing and his own, and the sea fire shone around the boat. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but it's sort of a bluish light that comes through the sea, especially in the Arctic. It's wild. They called it sea fire in Norway. And I'm sure somewhere else. As it did around the others, and when the surge splashed against it. Yes, well, said Bonsa to himself, and what he thought shall remain unsaid by my mouth. I think they're saying he said something crude. Then he closed the door for the third and last time and went into bed. There was grim fishing that winter, but every man drove himself as hard as he could and more, getting the fish ready and hung on the racks. But then came the accident. For you see, early in the morning of the 3rd of March, the boats rowed out in the best weather they could want. But before they were half finished pulling up their nets, a strong storm of shoreward wind and great seas blew up. And there was nothing to do other than to race ashore, giving the boats all the sail they could carry, and leave things in God's hands. The 3 skippers on the accompanying boats remained alongside one another for as long as possible, as was done in those days. But halfway to land, Abraham Onuk pulled ahead of the other 2, and the distance between them increased, so that Bonsa's Femboring fell a long way behind, and Søren's Petersen's Femboring came in last. Then suddenly a breaker came across Abraham Onuk's Femboring. It dipped, then rolled around. The folk got up to the keel and sat waiting for their accompanying boats to come and rescue them, but the weather was absolutely terrible. And when Bonsa intended to come about and lay to the hull, his crew rebelled, threatened to wrest the tiller out of his fist, and the moment was lost. But Søren Petersen's boat, which came after, laid to the hull, and first saved 3 men, then drifted off, crossed over again, and saved 2 more. But Abraham Onuk himself and the boy he sat with one arm about were washed away by the sea, and they did not see them any more, even though Søren Petersen, in spite of all human reason, for the 2nd time came about to the scene of the accident. But then, besides his own crew, he had 5 he had saved to bail the sea out, and as soon as he sailed, the boat full. They found Abraham Onuk's Femboring in an inlet west of Bretonus, and it was no worse than it was possible to put it in a suitable condition to continue fishing. Each of the boats added 1 to his own crew for those who had disappeared during the storm, and relinquished a man each, so the fishing continued with all 3 boats. But Bonsa went around with dark thoughts. It was not just the grief of his companion that gnawed and tormented him. The shame and contempt that he had to endure when the crew took his command from him on his own boat was worse than both grief and death. And had he still had the energy it required, then he would have chased every last one of them ashore again. The fishing season ended the week before Easter, and the 3 boats each had a fine winter lot. It was so bitterly grievous that Abraham Onuk and the lad were no longer alive. And Bonsa felt like a debtor to God, even though his own understanding acquitted him. My tea glued itself down. A stiff easterly wind blew on the day of the companion boats crossed out of the rough Sunded and began up Hasselfjord. And the boats remained alongside one another up the fjord. Then Soren Petersen came about called over to Bontbonson's Femboring. Well, Abraham and Oxa, you don't feel the cold much changing your shirt in this freezing easterly gale. Bonbonsa turned his face after the cry, and on the thwart, close beside him, sat Abraham, undressed to the waist, pulling his wool shirt over his head. The vision was only momentary, but it was enough to convince poor shaken Bonbonsa of the certainty that his worst fear bore the truth. The Revenant was after him. By God, it was true! The spring and summer were not dangerous to redeem. When daylight and sun reigned, the power of the dead counted for nothing. But when the darkness came in the autumn, Bonbonsa took care not to linger late down by the boathouse or in the outhouses. Not, you understand, that he had seen anything of the Revenant since that day on Hasselfjord. But Bonbonsa was not a man willing to hasten the meeting. And it was in the evening of Christmas Eve, after everyone had smartened themselves up for the holiday, the wife and the house discovered that they'd forgotten to tap some brandy, and so Bonbonsa took a tin pail, lit the barn lantern, and went out to the stabura, where the barrel lay. For as long as they had some about the house, they had to have brandy on the table on Christmas Eve. He left the stabura door open and put the lantern beside the barrel, which he tapped into the pail. And when he had tapped what he thought they needed over the weekend, he took the lantern to go. But there sat Abraham, across from the stabura doorstep, blocking his way. At first, Bonbonsa was frightened, as may be expected. But then his anger got to him, and he found the courage to speak the words of reason that he'd wanted to say to his dead companion for so long. "If it's you, Abraham, who has found it good to follow after me, even though you are dead, and if it is you who sits there on the doorstep and hinders me from going into mine, then I must tell you that you are not the man after your death that I held you to be whilst you yet lived. You know how I wanted to save you, but that my men took the power to do so from me and made me impotent aboard my own boat. And if you do not know, then you can hear it now. And never can I tell you with words how it hurt me that you fell away, and I was prevented from saving you. But now I ask, Abraham, that you come to me in my dreams when I have come to Mola, and then you tell me where you lie, so that I may put you in Christian soil. Yes, even if you are so broke up and stuck that I have to pick you out with my sheath knife, and pick you up bone by bone, put you in a sack, then you shall have the grave rest that you now resist so much." No more was said, but it seemed to be enough for the Revenant to float away, and Bonbonsa let himself out unhindered, with the Christmas brandy for himself and for those who sat waiting inside. And then on the Monday after the holiday, 2 of the accompanying boats arrived in Mola. The third had a new skipper and had stepped out of the team. That night, Bonbonsa dreamed that Abraham had come to him and told him where to find him. And it was in a narrow, deep rift in a steep, rocky knoll a little north of the harbor. So as soon as it was light, at least bright enough that he could see where to put his feet. Bonbonsa took an empty, clean bag and went where the revenant had said he was to be found. The rack of bones was stuck at the bottom of the rift between two huge stones, and it was the great toil and difficulty he pulled it loose and put all the stumps into the stack. He paid for the coffin, and he paid as much as one for an unharmed corpse. And then he sailed it to church and buried the coffin and what was in it, with all the honor and dignity that Abraham Anoxa's body could claim. And Bonbonsa had good reason to believe that Abraham Anoxa appreciated his grave rest, for he neither saw nor sensed that revenant after the parson had thrown earth onto the coffin. And that is a lovely told story by Regine Normann from her book Nordland Nights, which you can see on Simon Roy Hughes for free, translated, wow, on his blog. I think what stands out for me about this story is it's less a story about ghosts and spirits and revenants, which are generally vengeful ghosts, or at least ghosts that have something to settle from their life. And that it is more about this kind of abiding affection and regret that you see between these men who have sort of fished maybe unwise waters and kept their traditions. Anyways, I liked it. I realize no bowling. Maybe we can say Abraham is off bowling in a castle in a valley or something. My connection in my head, but I wasn't even going to pretend like it was enough to count, was that it is a restless spirit. And for the most part, bowling spirits seem to be restless spirits. GS says, I won't wonder why Abraham appeared that day, and then I see why. Very touching. Teary, crying emoji face. Yes, I really felt that one. Yes, it's very sweet. Because he's angry, but there's a real sincerity to it. And it's very beautifully told. There's a kind of, I don't know how to put a fine point on it other than there's a sort of dreamy cadence to it. You sort of drift between years and they feel like memories. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out what exactly informs her technique in the story to do that. But when I figure it out, as a writer, I'm going to steal it because I like it. If you enjoy this content, I have an entire playlist of like 50 videos, which you can watch in reverse. Because, as with all things, as you get further back, they're worse. But some are quite good. And I hope this was one of them. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. And if you like this video, give it a like. Because YouTube is brutal to anything that isn't like... And don't get me wrong, I'm not an old man here. I do like video games, but YouTube is brutal to anything that isn't like video games or getting mad about movies having the wrong actors or something. There was a version of YouTube. This is my old man moment. There was a version of YouTube in its first few years where, yes, there was silly stuff, but for the most part, it was just poorly produced, scratchy little content of some old man or something talking about his carvings of wood or something, and they'd be beautiful and you would remember them. And I guess I yearn for that community-centered creative moment where it wasn't so plagued with calls to action and so on. I say after doing a call to action. But anyways, if you like that, YouTube, give me a like. It might help. I don't think YouTube's coming back from what it is. Well, hopefully you enjoyed it anyways. We are going to do ghosts again next week, and we're going to do again a totally different thing. And because I actually did some planning this month, I will tell you what it is. Come in close. Come in close, because you're going to like this one. Did you know that the Sleepy Hollow is based on German folklore? We're going to look at Headless Horsemen, and it's going to be fun. Gia says, I like your expressive reading tonight, Rory. I always feel like I can't take too much credit for that, because it's truly... it's hard to rise above the writing if it's a little flat, right? And I don't think Regine does flat writing. So it's already there. I feel like I'm just sort of the record needle on it. But I didn't know that either about the Sleepy Hollow. So we're going to be looking at sort of the origins of Sleepy Hollow, Headless Horseman, and then we're going to be reading another Nordic tale that is thinly related, kind of about ghosts. Just because I want to. That's why I do most of the things here. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself. If you really enjoyed yourself, and you have the means, I do have the option to buy me a coffee down there. I really appreciate it. Buy me a table that's not broken or something like that. If you don't know, a couple of weeks ago, we learned together on stream that this table is barely holding itself together. But for the most part, I'm just happy for you to drop by and hear the stories. I'll keep the fire going for you. I hope you get yourself a good sleep. And if you hear any thundering in the night, well, who knows what it could be, but it could be a bunch of golden pins. So don't drop them in the forest for wood. Carry the golden pin home. You have a good night, and I'll keep the fire going.